All right, welcome to another installment of Texas history. We continue our lectures here today on the issue of Texas weather disasters, and frankly, we'll expand past that to man-made disasters and so forth. The fact of the matter is that when we say Texas weather disasters, last time we lectured together. I lectured to you. You watched and heard about hurricanes and rainfall issues. Today, we'll turn our attention to some of the other disasters that are acts of God, as the insurance agency calls it. And so we'll start off with tornadoes. And of course, Texas has had its fair share of tornadoes in its history. Some of you have gone through a few over your lifetime. I've seen one or two in person or have felt the effects of it. Nothing deadly, but certainly destructive on a property scale. But Texas, we have our fair share of tornadoes just because of the size of the state and its geographic location. We have a lot of them. Truthfully, our tornadoes, generally speaking, probably aren't quite as destructive in some respects, or at least not as numerous in the size. Those big, as they call them, wedge tornadoes that you see, say, in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. They're in the Dixie, I think they call it the Dixie Belt or the Dixie Alley. But anyways, basically Tornado Alley in the Deep South. They get some bad ones over there in Mississippi and Alabama and so forth. Well, anyways, but we do too, and we've had our fair share over the years. Just a couple to point out to you in destructive ability. I mean, you've had them in my lifetime when I was your age. I'm 43 now as I record this. Y'all about 20 or so, 18, 19, 20, 21 territory for the majority of you. When I was your age, there was a massive and a bad tornado up north of Austin at a town called Gerald. Messed it up real bad. That's one that comes to mind, and so forth. But historically, too, that I'll just point out to you, you had a big one in 1902 on a Sunday, and it was May 18th, Sunday, May 18th. The issue isn't the date exactly for me to remember. It's the day of the week. It was Sunday. It's at the town of Goliad. And for some of you who are watching this, you know exactly where Goliad is because you've been hunting down there. Or perhaps if you come from Victoria or some part of that territory, you've gone to Goliad on a field trip to the Presidio Mission Complex that the state has restored to preserve Texas history in the Spanish period and the Revolutionary period. Goliad is kind of a crossroads town. It's one of the oldest settlements in Texas. It goes back deep into the Spanish period. It acted for various reasons. We'll get more into it later in this course. But Goliad acted as kind of a crossroads, a way station. You had to pay your taxes and tolls there. If you were importing goods into Spanish Texas and later Mexican Texas, you paid those goods at Goliad. It's kind of the birthplace of the Texas cattle kingdom, or the cattle operations and such. This is all in the Spanish period for the most part. It's got an old and long history. But in 1902, of course, that's not Spanish controlled anymore. 1902, that is, it is the state of Texas, the American state of Texas. And in 1902, Goliad is a prosperous town. I wouldn't say it's rich or anything. It's certainly not a large city. It's not like Dallas or Santone or Houston or Galveston, certainly, or Galveston was in kind of its wreckage at that point. But in 1902, it had several thousand people living in it. Again, still a crossroads. People still live there for various agricultural, farming, ranching reasons. And on Sunday in May of 1902, a large tornado, evidently about 250 yards wide. And so think of that next time you're at an A&M football game or your old high school football game, and some of you played football and can remember running those gassers or whatever your coach called them, basically line up on the goal line and run to the end of the other goal line and back again and back again. So all I'm saying is just think about your football field, whether you were a cheerleader, you ran track around the field, you played on the field, whatever it was. Think of essentially 2.5 of those fields, and that's the width of that tornado. It's a big, what's meteorologically known as a wedge tornado, and it's like a big plow that sticks its basically a natural plow almost. It sticks itself into the ground, and its destructive path is horrible. You've seen them in more recent times. It's a phenomena that's been around since the big dawn of time, of course. But anyways, if your place is in the path of a wedge tornado, it can get out of hand rather quickly, and that's an understatement on my part. Well, the thing about this wedge tornado that went through Goliad is that it went through Goliad. And the thing that most tornadoes, with exceptions of course, oftentimes the thing about tornadoes is they thankfully they go through largely unpopulated territories. I'm not saying it's just countryside after countryside, but a house here or a farmhouse there is bad enough. But when the tornado squares up a city or a large town and runs right through it, then you've got some major issues and death and destruction on your hands. And that's what happened to Goliad on a Sunday. Happened near noontime, basically. So if you know anything about Sundays in small town Texas, you know that's church time. And there were some churches that were still in session. One church, I don't remember if it was a Presbyterian, probably Methodist or Baptist, knowing the religious geography of Texas at that time. Probably one of those. I've not taken the time to look it up. But all that to say is that it went right through the heart of Goliad and destroyed buildings left and right, just wrecked them out, and caught the parishioners or the congregants in that church and killed them all. I think killed about 40 or 45 people in that one church when the tornado went through. It was a horrible affair, and when it was all said and done, about 114 dead at Goliad in one day. So basically, it was a horrible event. About 50 years later, in fact, just a hair over 50 years, about 51 years later, you're going to have another bad tornado, and I'm skipping a whole bunch of other smaller events just to make the point that you can have some death and destruction from tornadoes in Texas, and just to increase your knowledge. Same sort of idea, large wedge tornado passes through a major city, and it affects a city that I'm going to spend more time talking about here in a later lecture, but I think this was the capstone of the decline and fall of Waco. And so the Waco Tornado of 1953, took place, of course, I think probably should be springtime as well. I don't have the exact date in front of me. That doesn't matter. But what the Waco Tornado of 1953 does is it goes right down Main Street. It's not Main Street. It's what, Valley Mills Drive or something like that. It's basically running perpendicular to the river. It's behind, if you've been up to Waco and you've been there to Chip and Joanna's operation, meaning Chip and Joanna Gaines, Magnolia Table, Magnolia Farms, Magnolia this, that, and the other. The reason people go to Waco nowadays, if they're not going to Baylor or for some other, I guess, reason, which is funny because if you think about Waco, you don't think of Waco as being hip. And maybe it isn't anymore, but it was about 2 years ago, 2017-18. But Waco, at one point in time in the 19th century, was a major metropolitan area of Texas, and it was certainly some with that into the early 20th century. We'll talk more about that as we go. But Waco, by the time you get to 1920, and certainly by the time you get to 1930, and clearly by 1940, Waco had declined. But the Great Depression and the World War, but especially the Great Depression, had driven many of those small-time, and I don't mean that as a derogatory statement, but a lot of yeoman-type farmers, meaning they only plowed or they farmed, say, 50 to 100, 150 acres, small farms. And they're not plantation. They were never big planters or anything like that. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, you had thousands of small-time farmers plowing the fields around Waco. We'll talk more about that in a coming lecture. But the fact is that Waco was benefited from it and made Waco a prosperous city. You see it on the back of cotton. That's part of the reason, and I'll tell the full story later. But that's part of the reason why Waco exists, or rather Baylor is at Waco, is because of cotton growing in that part of the world. But because of the Great Depression, the collapse of the cotton industry or the cotton prices in the 1930s, and it really actually began in the mid-20s, but going all the way basically to the outbreak of the World War and all the foreclosures that happened, a lot of those little farmers moved on. They moved to Houston, maybe to work in the ship channel, maybe to work in the petrochemicals down there. Others moved to Dallas. Others are going to move out of state, maybe California, because California, as you well know, particularly say from the grapes of wrath, I guess it would be, the fact of the matter is that California was considered a kind of a a place one could go to for a new start in the 1930s. Well, anyways, that part of Texas is depopulating for a period of time, and Waco was dying on the vine. You could see it, and then the tornado of 1953 cuts the city in two, just literally like cleaves it like an axe or a butcher, basically a cleaver would do, like you cut it in two. It kills 114 people as well. It just wrecks the city out. And Waco seemingly took 30 or 40 years to get over it. I don't mean that there was just, unpicked up bodies, or there was there was rubble laying in the streets 20 years later. I don't mean that. But it was, in addition to being a physical and a human blow to the city, it also, I think, delivered an emotional and psychological blow to the city that it took basically into the 1990s, maybe even 2000 before Waco started to pick up. Throw in some other factors, too, about the growth of other cities and what have you. And Waco, though it had the I-35 corridor, and Waco still was a sizable city, it just kind of was wobbly and was never quite the same again. Over the years, I've taken to calling Waco the city that was supposed to be. It was supposed to be one of the great cities of Texas. I alluded to this and referred to it in the previous lecture about Galveston being the great city of Texas in 1900, and the thinking was there was going to be another one. There was a lot of smart money at the year 1900 when the Galveston Hurricane changes history. The fact of the matter is that there was a lot of thinking that there is going to be one second great city in Texas, an interior city, and that thinking was it was Waco. But that tornado did a lot of damage. I talked with a guy at one point in time whose father lived up there, and he was on patrol for looters. There's always been looters, by the way, if you ever wondered about that. Is that a recent phenomenon? No. It's the worm in the apple of the strong taking advantage of the destroyed, or the parasitic taking advantage of the destroyed. And trying to steal things. So there was looters running around Waco in 1953, and Phil's father was deputized, basically emergency deputizing, and he was on patrol to stop and to arrest and to break looting. So anyways, those are two major tornadoes that do some damage in Texas. We've got plenty of other examples. You'll have them through Wichita Falls, Dallas, and on you can go. There's Rock Springs out west of San Antonio. Those just come to mind readily and quickly. But generally speaking, the two that are the worst are the ones I pointed out to you, Goliad in 1902 and Waco in 1953 for their sheer destructive forces. And then, of course, also you're going to have a good number of floods in Texas. We're going to talk about river floods briefly as well. And what's the thing to remember about this? This is really a kind of a geography set of lectures, but there's also a cultural and maybe political angle to it as well. Geography, if you think geography is just about reading maps and looking at physical things such as mountains and rivers, yes, that's part of geography. That's physical geography, but you can have geography take a lot of different forms. And it's actually, the study of geography is actually quite fascinating. In times, maybe I should have been a geographer and not just a historian, but I'm pretty happy as a historian. But all that to say, though, is that geography in Texas, with regard to rivers and such, we can go through that rather quickly. Just for boundaries and such, the political geography of Texas in a modern sense. And first of all, by the way, Texas does not always look like it does today. Some of you may have in your house or your apartment or your condominium what Texas looked like, or at least what it believed it looked like in 1836. That's arguable because not everybody agreed with what Texas declared its borders to be in 1836. But in fact, Texas under the Spanish period is really kind of an ill-defined territory that is much, much smaller than it is today, or in 1836. Then the Mexicans gained their independence in 1821. And in the Constitution of 1824 in Mexico, the Mexicans joined Texas in the larger state of Coahuila. So the state was formed as Coahuila y Texas, Coahuila in Texas, because of the lack of population of both states, but especially Texas. Like I said, it was been depopulated. And so that was where Texas is really big, at least as far as we'd understand it. But Texas's southern boundary during the Mexican period, this is worth noting. I would put this in your notes because I'll either use it on an exam soon or I'll use it later on an exam, but it's because it's a flashpoint. The southern boundary of Texas during the Mexican period of our history is a river, and that is the Oasis River. Talk more about the Oasis in time, but the fact of the matter is that down around Corpus Christi, if you're familiar with that part of the world again, the Oasis River flows into Corpus Christi Bay, Oasis Bay, and that river formed the southern boundary of Coahuila, Texas. And what between the Oasis River and the Rio Grande, or Rio Bravo, as it's sometimes also referred to in our history, is what's known as the Oasis Strip. So today, of course, the southern boundary of Texas. All of you should know this. If you don't, you need to know this. It is in the southern boundary of the United States, frankly, as well, because it's not just a state border, but it's an international boundary. That is the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande. Like I said, also it has AKA. It's also known as, and it's historically known this, and to my knowledge, it's still called this at times, and maybe a lot of the time in northern Mexico, because you actually have a Rio Grande in Mexico, in today's Mexico, 2020 Mexico. So there is some confusion. But for the longest time, the Rio Grande was referred to as Rio Bravo, Bravo, the Rio Bravo. And so if you've ever been to Brownsville, some of you might be from the Deep Valley, the Rio Grande Valley, Laredo, Del Rio, Eagle Pass, maybe went and camped at the Big Bend, El Paso del Norte, or El Paso, of course, as we call it today, and then the Rio Grande running all the way up into Colorado, and that's where its headwaters are. The Rio Grande is, at least with regard to Texas, is the longest river in Texas. Other boundaries in Texas, we're going to talk about rivers just for a few minutes. So the Rio Grande's a major one, and I'll tell some more stories about the Rio Grande and the Spanish period of our history. But also, the eastern boundary of Texas is the Sabine River, And so the Sabine River, by the way, is a slow river, but it's also a very wet river compared to, say, the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande, because of where it runs from and where it runs to, lack of rainfall and so forth. The Rio Grande is kind of smallish, especially in a modern sense, since there's a lot of irrigating that goes through it. So it does, like the Jordan River in the Middle East or the Colorado River out in Arizona. A lot of that water is used for agricultural purposes. But anyways, the Sabine River, or as it was known originally, is Sabinal. It's a kind of an Anglo-English word, Sabine is. But Sabinal, S-A-B-I-N-A-L. The Sabine River, formerly, Sabinal originally, means cypress. And so if you've ever been into deep East Texas along the Toledo Bend or Sam Rayburn reservoirs, if you've ever been into deep East Texas down in those swamps around Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Orange, you know as well as I do there are a lot of cypress trees down that part of the world. And by the way, if you ever have anybody, if you ever come across the opportunity to get a hold of cypress wood or cypress furniture, and they used to make, 150 years ago, they used to make furniture out of cypress wood, and you paid a pretty penny then. You will pay a pretty penny now. But because cypress is so hardy, cypress is so not just resistant to disease in its natural state, but also as furniture, its resistance to rot and decay or anything like that. Basically, if you have cypress furniture, it's going to last unless you break it because you were messing around and got into a barroom fight with it, something like that. I'm being over the top, of course, but unless you messed around and broke it over somebody's back like it was a WWE event, the fact is that cypress furniture is going to last your entire lifetime, and would be passed down from your generation to the next, to the next, to the next. So lots of cypress trees out that part of the world, and originally the Sabine River is not the eastern boundary of Texas, and that was really a disputed issue. That eastern boundary of Texas was a disputed issue until about 1819. We'll talk more about it later in the course because it has a large role to play in the growth and the Anglos coming to Texas, amongst other things. But the Sabine River is declared the eastern boundary of Texas by a treaty. The treaty is, by the way, called, put this in your notes, the Adams, like John Quincy Adams, and the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. John Quincy Adams is one. The Onis is Don Luis Onis, who was a Spanish minister, and that does not mean clergyman. That means like ambassador. The Spanish ambassador to the United States. And so that settled that boundary, the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. Well, that treaty also is going to settle the northern boundary of Texas. Some of you have crossed this many times going to Oklahoma. Family lives up there. Maybe mom and dad get gambling up there. Maybe went to an OU football game. Who knows? But when you cross into Oklahoma, you cross the Red River. And that same treaty also codified and made international law or international agreement that the northern boundary of Texas was going to be that of the Red River. So obviously it gets its name if you've ever crossed it over there on I-35 or somewhere around Bonham or something, Fannin County or over toward Texarkana. The Red River gets its name because of the color of the water, because the sand and the silt and the dirt, the land that it drains has that red clay element to it, so the water itself is red as it can be, oftentimes in its natural state. So the Red River, another long boundary of Texas. So those are your boundaries. So the Sabine on the east, between us, meaning Texas and Louisiana, between us and Oklahoma is the Red River, and between us and today's and Old Mexico is the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo. So those are your major boundaries of Texas. And as we talk about we're talking about disasters and flooding and so forth. The fact of the matter, when we get to river flooding, you're going to see that you're going to have a rash of river floods in Texas, but only during a certain period of our history. When I say that, by the way, the period of time for us to have all those river floods is roughly about 1860 or 1880 to about 1940, maybe 1960. Well, but certainly, it depends on how you want to say it and depends on how you do it. But certainly 1860 at the earliest. But really, you don't start seeing floods in central Texas on rivers until about 1880, and then they all peter out, and they all just, the major floods, the big ones, the noteworthy floods that really destroy a lot of property, kill people, and so forth, that they just kind of disappear by 1940, certainly 1950 at the latest. And today, you may have floods on rivers, but they're generally on like the Llano or the Pedernales or the Trinity up toward Dallas and that sort of territory there. You do have floods, but they're generally speaking much more limited. And so I want you to think about that. Why on earth would Texas, during our history, especially during modern Texas history, why would there be only an era, an epoch of river flooding in Texas along the Brazos or the Trinity or the Colorado? Again, I'm not saying it doesn't flood ever today, but the reality is back in that time period, say 1880 to 1940, effectively a 60-year window, maybe 80-year window, you had regular floods and you had catastrophic flooding on those rivers from time to time. What was it that did it? And so I want you to think about that. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But when we talk about rivers, I'm going to start moving from east to west, and when I get back to those central Texas rivers, I'll pick that question I just posed to you back up again. But the fact is that when we start from east to west, and we got the Sabine River, also known as the Sabinal-Cypress River. Let's move now westward, crossing the state as if we were driving from Louisiana, say over there, and on Highway 190 and was crossing through. The next river up is called the Natchez, N-E-C-H-E-S. And I used to pronounce it the Natchez, and I had a student about a decade ago in class, in a Texas history class, and I kept saying Natchez, 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 and she was from deep East Texas, and she had that East Texas drawl. Now, all of you can hear in my voice a twang, a Texas twang, a Central Texas twang. It's sometimes better, it's sometimes worse. Depends on how much I want to control it, and sometimes I don't care. But I've got more of a drawl than most people do who come from Houston or Dallas or San Antonio. But if you've never heard it before, you've never been into deep East Texas, those folks over there have a different drawl than I do, and I have a different drawl than those people from West Texas. That's actually a fascinating look at how English, or well, frankly, it'd be Spanish as well if I knew it better, but also how in English, in Texas, the spoken language of English, you have these different twangs and drawls and cadences and dialects almost, and everybody speaking the same language. But if you've ever been to West Texas, you thought about going to Lubbock at Texas Tech, the fact of the matter is you get out there in West Texas, they speak differently than we do, and they kind of think differently than we do. But East Texas, they got that twang. Anyways, this girl's from East Texas. Anyways, she corrected me in class, and I would not suggest you do this, but she corrected me in class and said, she raised her hand up, and she was kind of agitated. You could see that. She raised her hand up like, Mr. Giesenslaw? Yes, ma'am. How can I help you? it's not Natchez, it's Natchez. And she had that kind of the Natchez sort of sound to her. And I was like, okay, the Natchez River. That's kind of the way I make sure I say it from here on out. The Natchez River. The Natchez River, or Natchez, as I still sometimes revert back to, but the Natchez River in East Texas is named after the Indian tribes that lived there amongst the Caddoans. It's part of the Caddoan Confederacy, the Caddo-Hassani Confederacy. There was a whole bunch of them. They were all just interrelated, but not closely related sort of thing, hence the word Confederacy. But anyways, all that to say is it's named after an Indian tribe in East Texas, and that little body of water is, generally speaking, not overly important. I would not spend, and I'm not going to spend 2 hours telling you about the future of Texas is tied to the waters of the Natchez River. But I will say this, and this is something you need to remember. That Natchez River is an important little footnote. It's not a footnote. It's an important side note. Kind of an aside in the Texas Revolution. In the Texas Revolution, we know about the Battle of the Alamo. And in the Texas Revolution, we know about the Battle of San Jacinto. And people know about Goliad and the massacre at Goliad, and on. Gonzales, come and take it. A couple of you might even have in your apartment or condo a flag that has the come and take it. Instead of maybe the little cannon, you might have an AK-47 or an AR-15. I don't know. I've seen them all. I mean, come and take it. Some people have a Bible, come and take it. Some people say, come and take my cigarettes. I don't know. But all that to say is that come and take it, that's Gonzales. But one of the great controversies in Texas at the time, and especially later on with the life and times of Sam Houston, the fact is that the Natchez River was probably what you can call in your notes a tripwire. It was there was some discussions between Andrew Jackson, who was president of the United States in 1835. In fact, he was president from 29 to 37, elected in 28 and 32 respectively. But you got to understand, the president's elected in 28 or 2020, but he actually doesn't take office until basically the next calendar year, the start of the next calendar year. And so Jackson was president, and Jackson, one of his surrogate sons, and you'll get the full story on this later, but one of his surrogate sons, and he had several, was Sam Houston. They were great friends, and Houston sometimes will disappoint Jackson about like any son will disappoint a father from time to time. It is rare that a son is always dutiful and loyal to the father at all times and agrees with everything the father says. It's just not the way men work, and frankly, moms and daughters as well. You know how that goes. Some of you know quite well how that goes. But the fact is that Jackson was president of the United States in 1835, and Sam Houston had been kind of in a semi-exile in Texas, but he was also, Houston had been kind of agitating and working behind the scenes and trying to foment perhaps what you can call a revolution. Houston was certainly up to something. And there was discussion about revolution, because at that point in time, Stephen F. Austin, who was one of the great peace proponents in Texas, was locked in a Mexican jail in Mexico City. Depends on the time, depends on which exact jail you're talking about. But Texas in 1835 was full of excitement. In fact, actually, the Texas Revolution begins in 1835. The major events we think of, excepting Gonzales, is in 1836. So anyways, all that to say, though, is that Houston and Jackson have a closed-door session. What is said in there, we don't know. It's certainly not just about niceties and, how's your family doing, Sam? How's your family doing, President or General Jackson? It wasn't that. Jackson in Houston certainly talked about what would happen if Texas goes into revolution. And there's no secret that Jackson, and frankly Americans prior to Jackson, John Quincy Adams, coveted Texas, and they wanted to purchase it or get it from Mexico, or before that, Spain, frankly. There were some people who thought that Texas was purchased in the Louisiana Purchase, and we'll get into that in this course as well. But back to the Natchez River. Houston's assessment of Texas is that Texas itself could not break away from Mexico without outside assistance, and that meant American assistance. The general consensus is that the Mexican army, though flawed, and you'll know more about that. It sounds like everything I say today you'll know more about that later. But the Mexican army was flawed. It had a lot of problems on the leadership side and the logistics side. It was a mess. But still, all that to say, Mexico, for her flaws as a military power, was still stronger than a ragtag bunch of half-trained and half-drunk militiamen. Now, that's me being a little bit hard, but to make the point. But basically, Houston did not have a lot of confidence in the Texians. And by the way, you call, prior to Texas American statehood, Texas American statehood in 1845, we're not called Texans, we're called Texians. And so, but Sam Houston had low confidence in the quality and the fighting ability, meaning organized military fighting ability of the Texians. I don't think he doubted their spirit, but spirit can only get you so far when you get onto the battlefield against an organized or mostly organized foe or enemy. So you get out there. I mean, this is not a football game. This is not a sporting event where, everybody goes home except for the guy who broke his leg and he goes to the hospital. But everybody goes home and he goes home too eventually. When we talk about football, I mean, everybody survives basically. You get into a battle, especially a revolution, not everybody's going to be excited about you having a revolution and trying to break away a sizable portion of the nation. Heck, if you know American history, the United States fought a protracted civil war of about 4 years to hold the southern states in the Union. I mean, that was one of the major war aims of the Civil War. It wasn't just to free the slaves, but it was also that secession was illegal, that once a state enters the Union, the state or the states cannot leave. And it's the same principle with Mexico. And so Houston figured that realistically, his assessment was Texas couldn't break away on its own. We needed help. And so what Houston and Jackson did, and none of this is written down, and we can only surmise by Houston's actions and kind of snippets and little vignettes that Houston says later, that Houston and Jackson had agreed that if a revolution did break out and armed conflict commenced, and Houston was able to maneuver himself into the slot of general-in-chief, which of course he did, that Houston would retreat, which he does. And he would retreat through Texas with that army, whatever it was, whether it was 150 men or 500 men or 800 men or 1,000 men, he would retreat back into East Texas, and by doing so draw Santa Anna, or whoever the Mexican general chasing Houston would be, but would draw the Mexican army that was in pursuit, draw them deep into East Texas, which would accomplish several things. First of all, that in East Texas, that is for the revolution, that's going to be your hotbed. That's going to be your base. The Anglos, the Texas, or the Texian Anglos, or the Texians who are of Anglo descent or American immigrants, they are the ones who are going to be most fervently in favor of revolution. And so you're falling back into your heartland. So that's in a sense good. It has its problems. We'll know more about that later. But it also gets you closer to the United States, which most of those Anglos had come from. And the thinking is, because of what Houston says and what Jackson does or issues orders, kind of secretive orders to the Western Army that's in Louisiana, all that to say is that it looks like that Houston's and Jackson's prearranged agreement was the Texian army would fall back into deep East Texas going toward Nacogdoches, which was a settlement then, a city then in Texas, would pass for a city, and that Houston would cross the Natchez River, back to that river now. He would cross the Natchez River, and the Mexicans would not know anything about the tripwire, the prearranged agreement, and that when the Mexican army crossed that Natchez River, that would be the tripwire that would bring the U.S. Army into the Texas Revolution, and then the American Army, which was certainly comparable and arguably, and you'll find out in the war with Mexico, frankly, better led than the Mexican Army. That's not in dispute. The idea is that the American Army would break or destroy the Mexican Army. And then Texas would gain its independence. The Mexican government would collapse, or at least would sue for peace, and Texas would not gain its independence. Texas would probably turn around and apply for statehood in the American Federal Union. That's a long way to say that the Natchez River there in East Texas, at some parts, it's just a little old ditch, it seems like. but it's a river, and it flows into Beaumont. That river, the Natchez River, is itself a tripwire in the Texas Revolution. So we got that taken care of. Well, let's move westward into further into Texas. So that brings us to the next river, and it's going to take me a few minutes to talk about this, probably the balance of this lecture today, and I'll have to stop there, and then we'll just keep on going westward. Like I said, if you keep seeing me looking over, it's either I'm looking at notes that's down in front of me, or I'm looking at a map that's hanging on my wall in the Barndo bunker here in Greater Snook, Texas, and so I can see and kind of visualize what I'm about to talk about. Well, anyways, all that to say, though, is the next river up is the Trinity River. Many of you passed over that. You've crossed over it. It's referred to by the Spanish as Trinidad, La Santísima Trinidad, the Sainted Trinity. And if you know your Catholic theology, you know your Christian practice and theology, the Trinity is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It is the idea. It is the theology of God in three persons or three in one. It's a great mystery. It's a hard thing to understand. But it's one of the core principles of Christianity, regardless of denomination. So the Trinity River in East Texas is named for that. Trinity River is a lot of water flowing down, a lot of water in East Texas, a lot of rain in East Texas. As I've already said to you in a previous lecture, it rains a lot more in East Texas than it does in, say, Austin. You know that. Some of you know that quite well. But the fact of the matter is the Trinity River, we'll talk about it in several ways. We'll start first with East Texas as a kind of a territory, and I'm just going to jump off, and as I said in the syllabus, anecdotes about local Texas. This is me talking about modern Texas. This is me talking about 20th century Texas. It's stuff that I would never get to if I did it strictly chronological. But this allows me to tell stories about East Texas and what goes on over in that part of the world. So I guess where we could start with the Trinity River is, first of all, let's get a little stuff out of the way here. The Trinity River is going to help be one of the first flashpoints of the Texas Revolution. It's called the battles, or rather the disturbances at Anahuac. Anahuac, Anahuac. Some of you driven through or driven by Anahuac because of you're headed to Louisiana or headed to Beaumont or something like that. They're out east of Houston, but the disturbances at Anahuac are kind of the coming of the Texas Revolution stuff. But in the 20th century, when we look at East Texas, we'll start first and foremost with the oil industry. So East Texas, and I'm going to include Beaumont and Port Arthur down at Spindletop. The fact of the matter is that the Texas oil industry in the 19th century is born because of the discovery of oil in 1901 at Spindletop right outside of Beaumont. Beaumont are going to have these salt domes, these sulfur domes, and you're going to have various individuals who've basically come to the conclusion that there probably might be oil here. There was this desire to have and to find oil in Texas and in other places. I mean, you're going to find oil in massive quantities in Louisiana, but the first oil fields, as some of you well know, isn't in Texas. The first rock oil, as they sometimes have called it early on, the first oil in the United States was found in Titusville, Pennsylvania. So that's where, if you've ever changed your oil and you used Quaker State or had Pennzoil, or just said, or you went to the Quickie Lube place and the guy said, "Well, we've got Pennzoil on sale for $18 for a quart," and you're like, "You're not $18 a quart, but $18 for an oil change," and you said, "Yeah, whatever, go ahead." Pennzoil, that's Pennsylvania oil. Quaker State, Pennsylvania. So that's where all that illusion comes from. But anyways, there was oil in eastern Ohio in the early, or rather late 19th century. There was oil in western Pennsylvania, Titusville, all that sort of thing. But it was sufficient for the period of time. But what comes in the Industrial Revolution and mechanization and the internal combustion engine and frankly plastics and everything else that comes after it, the reality is you're going to need a lot more oil. And you do discover it amongst other places, Texas and Spindletop, and it's just, you can look around. Some of you might even be looking up Spindletop right now. The famous picture of Spindletop is that derrick, and it's just blowing out the top. It's just gushing everywhere, all over the place. That was quite impressive. The thing, though, is that when you talk about Spindletop and just the gusher that's going up and over the top, okay, great. So, but The thing is that there's also some other photos, and you can look it up. Say it might be under a Google search of Spindletop, but you'll see there's some pictures of when they finally corralled the oil. I mean, it's laying on the ground. It's as filthy as they come. But this is early on, so things that we would just be aghast at. In 1901, they're trying to figure out how to cap a well. I mean, it's pretty nasty stuff. But you see these big lakes of oil because the oil was so close to the ground. I mean, there was just so much head pressure. You would see little seepages of oil. I mean, the tar balls of Galveston are kind of an example of that in a sense. But you see the oil close to the ground and so on. But East Texas, deep East Texas, Beaumont has that. And so there is a rush for oil discovery down that part of the world. It's going to help produce, and I'll talk more about this probably in the next lecture just because of time constraints, but it's going to help produce the great petrochemical factories and refineries there along the Houston Ship Channel, there on Buffalo Bayou. Maybe I'll just talk about this now and just get the oil out of the way, and I'll save Dallas and Fort Worth for the next lecture. But anyways, all that to say though is that you're going to see in deep East Texas and down around Beaumont, Port Arthur, even to this day, a massive influence on the economy, a large draw of people to that part of the world to prospect, to wildcat and look for oil, to process oil, to refine oil and its products and various and sundry other things. Some of you probably have friends. I've had some former students of mine who have gone, who didn't go to college. They work for me, say, building the fences that I refer to from time to time. One guy just recently, I think of, he went down to Beaumont to become an apprenticed welder, basically so he could learn to be kind of a pipe fitter or some other sort of thing. They're hard work, hard labor, but if you're good at it and you can pass tests and certifications and you don't bust the weld test, you can make some good money at that. Even at times during a bus cycle like we are when I'm recording this lecture. Boom cycle, shoot, a lot of people make money. But to be fair about it, southwestern Louisiana, down Calcasieu Lake, Lake Charles, that territory there, deep East Texas, excuse me, not deep East Texas, but certainly southeastern Texas, around the Golden Triangle of Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Orange is kind of, in a sense, I got to be careful how I say this, but some of the last parts of Texas to be settled. I mean, I don't want to make it say the last. That would probably be best described as Loving County out in West Texas, because it's arguably not settled to this day. But the thing is that you live down that part of the world. It's hard. It's hot. It's sweaty. It's disagreeable. Mosquitoes are legion down that way. Remember, in 1900, there is no cure for malaria. There is no cure for yellow fever. So you're taking your life in your hands living down on the coast. Well, anyways, all that to say is that what drew people into that part of the world was the opportunity to make a lot of money with oil. And so they did, and they could. The East Texas oil field is more than just Beaumont, Port Arthur, Orange, and the ship channel of Houston and Texas City. I should throw Texas City in there too, because that's a major part of the story. This is the overarching theme of these lectures. Isn't just, maybe it is cultural and geographical history. But the fact of the matter is East Texas produced millions and millions and millions of gallons, or rather barrels of oil, and thousands and thousands and thousands of cubic feet of natural gas, some of which was used and some of which was just belched into the air. In the scheme of this, so we'll see if I get my notes right in front of me. Where'd you go, New London? There you are. So when we talk about how much oil was being made in East Texas, let's roll our time period forward to get past Spindletop of at the turn of the 20th century. Let's roll our time period into the 1930s. This would be about 37 actually. In fact, I'm almost certain it's 1937. But let's roll our territory, our minds toward 1937. If you know your basic American history, and I've already talked about it in the form of what wasn't happening in Texas, you know the 1930s are the Great Depression and that great economic calamity that seemingly is omnipresent in black and white, but of course we know that they were in color. But that black and white with the Great Depression has kind of cast a pall over a horrible time in our economic history. As you well know and may have noticed, some of your family members may have noticed certainly that when everything blew up, figuratively speaking, in March and April, when we were starting to figure out, oh my gosh, we got the virus, because I'm recording this in 2020 in late August of 2020. But in March of 2020 and April of 2020, when the virus started getting around in the United States in earnest, the schools had already shuttered in most of the country. You also noticed too, and some of you noticed quite literally, because mom and dad stayed home and you just didn't go anywhere. Economic activity slowed down quite a bit. People were not flying because the thinking was flying was not safe. As we record this, it seems to be more and more clear that flying is perhaps far safer than going to inside a building, because the planes, they have scrubbers and they recirculate the air all the time, and they get outside air, bring it in. And so that being this virus is airborne largely, it's communicated through droplets and aerosols, that the airplanes are quite a bit safer than we originally thought. But people didn't fly. People didn't drive. And so there was a whole lot of oil being produced in West Texas and the Permian Basin. Some of you got family that work out in Midland, Odessa, Big Spring, out that part of the world. There's oil produced around here in what's called the Eagle Ford Shale, and so on. And then you got oil produced in the Bakken up in North Dakota. All that to say is that when you have an economic downturn and you're pumping out oil hand over fist like we were in the first part of 2020, the fact of the matter is, when you have an economic downturn and you got way too much oil, you got what's called a glut, and the prices go like that. I would not call him a friend, but he's a classmate of mine. I graduated in 1995 from my high school, and 1995, this fellow named Matthew did as well. And he got into the oil business. He lived down around Sabine. He had notes on a truck. This is all public knowledge from Facebook, so it's not like I'm sharing dark secrets here. But he had notes on trucks and cars and a house note and all that sort of stuff. And then I noticed somewhere in the springtime they announced that they were moving back up to Fort Worth, because the oil business in the Eagle Ford down around Karn City and Seguin and that part of the world had all collapsed, and they'd all lost their jobs. So where I'm going with this is that when you have an economic downturn or an economic recession or an economic depression, whatever exactly causes it is immaterial, the oil prices oftentimes go down through the floor. And that happened in the 1930s as well, because you had a lot of oil and economic activity just wasn't there. And plus, you didn't have as much usage for synthetics at that point either. Synthetic rubber and synthetic this and that hadn't really caught on just yet. Which is all to say is that the barrels of oil in East Texas were just simply cheap, a couple of bucks a barrel sort of thing. And that was real dollar a barrel sort of stuff, $2 a barrel, not the minus 30, which was a kind of a hiccup, and it wasn't true, but it was basically, to say it like this, it was persistently low in the 1930s, whereas today, when I'm recording this, oil per barrel is about $42 a barrel. All that to say, though, is that you had wildcatting and you had development of what's called the East Texas oil field going on. And the town I want you to put in your notes, by the way, the man who's going to help develop it and kind of discover it is a guy named H.L. Hunt. H.L. Hunt, H-U-N-T. If you're a football fan, one of the football teams is the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Kansas City Chiefs is owned by the Hunt family, and his H.L. Hunt's son, he had several, was a man named Lamar Hunt. Lamar Hunt owned that team. The Hunt family still owns the Kansas City Chiefs. They originally actually the Dallas Texans back in the AFL in the 1960s. But anyways, of course, Kansas City won the Super Bowl in February 2020. Anyways, all that to say is that the Hunts made their money in oil. H.L. Hunt was a strange man. He had multiple families. He was a bit of a polygamist, a closeted polygamist, and so forth. He was kind of a strange man, but a lot of those wildcatters are kind of quirky anyways. And that's being generous on my part, saying that's quirky. But at the same time, when you say Hunt, it was Hunt who develops East Texas's oil field. I mean, you pump out millions of barrels of oil. How important is this? Later on, say now in the 1940s, in about 1944 or so, Hunt is either on a phone call or he's called to Washington, D.C. I think he goes to see him. But Hunt meets President Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, early 1940s. And Roosevelt, who was a good backslapper and he was a great politician and could tell you what you wanted to hear and knew how to pump a man's ego, said that, Mr. Hunt, if we win, and rather when we win World War II or when we win this war, it will be because of you. Now, obviously, Roosevelt was making this man feel good. But there is some, and frankly, a lot of truth in that when World War II got going and we really got organized, a large reason, and this is taking nothing away from your ancestors. If you had a great-grandfather who fought in World War II, I'm not saying anything that he was he didn't win the war. My grandfather fought in the World War as well. But I would argue as a historian what helped win World War II, and arguably our greatest contribution, was all the planes, tanks, trucks, guns, and lastly, aviation fuel, gasoline, lubricants, synthetic rubber, plastic, and on we can go. The fact of the matter is that you had a whole lot of oil that is going to be turned into things you can burn and things you can lubricate with, basically make a modern war machine go. And a lot of that oil from East Texas gets sent down to Beaumont and Port Arthur and to Texas City to be refined. So that's, I think Roosevelt was being over the top. He could do that. He's a president. He's also a good backslapper, as I said. He's a good politician. And I think there's a pretty big kernel of truth in the statement that the oil industry helped us win World War II in many ways. So the old phrase in that time period was better living through chemistry. And now it's kind of I say it as a joke, better living through chemistry, and I'm normally referring to steroids. But they meant that is all the synthetic things that we can build. I mean, shoot, think about you watching this right now. You may be watching it on your screen, which is made out of synthetic material, a lot of petroleum there. Your iPhone, just think about it. You look around your apartment, you look around your house. As I record this, how much is made of or produced by or made to market by the oil industry or the petrochemical industry? It's pretty big. But I started this out with disasters. And I want you to put in your notes a town's name, and the name is New London, Texas. New London, like the English city. New London, Texas, 1937. New London, Texas was a prosperous city, and New London, Texas was a town. It's not a full-blown city like a Dallas is, but it's a sizable town. Several thousand people live there, all that sort of stuff there. New London, Texas was prosperous, and when we think of 1937, it's really actually what's called the Roosevelt recession. It's the country had started to pick up, and then did that, and then it did that, and World War II ends the Great Depression. Well, the Roosevelt recession of 37 hurt a lot of folks, and if you were in other parts of Texas, it was pretty desperate and desolate at times. So a lot of folks had moved on. I've already said that several ways to you. But in 1937, if you were to travel to New London, Texas, you would look and say, my gosh, what happened here? This place is wonderful. It looks like it's just champagne and oysters for everybody. It's just, how can you go wrong? I mean, it's just great stuff. Well, New London was sitting on a mountain of oil. And understand this about Texas school funding, and you ought to put this in your notes. If you have any oil wells, and I'm talking about producing oil wells, not something that's old and just petering around. But the fact of the matter is that, or piddling around, I guess you could say. But the fact of the matter is that when you talk about oil wells, all that stuff is taxable. The Texas state school system then as now, in 1937 or 2020, is funded by local property taxes, at least on a state level or a local level, local property taxes. I pay them for my house, my barn door bunker, etc., and so forth, and also for the oil wells. Sometimes they're big bills and sometimes they're negligible. I mean, that sort of thing. All of which is to say is that there was a lot of oil and there was a lot of money coming into the coffers of New London. And you may be thinking, why didn't New London share that wealth, so to speak, with other districts like they do today, what they call the Robin Hood Plan? The reality was in 1937, you had no Robin Hood Plan. If you were a wealthy district, you were a wealthy district, and congratulations, God blessed you, and you get to keep that money. So if you're, Hallsville ISD, or if you're some little small school down the road, 20 miles down the road from New London, and then maybe the district over, and you don't have an oil field underneath you, you might still be close to a one-room school, or at least maybe 2 or 3 rooms, and you're struggling to get pencils and paper. Whereas New London, they have pencils, papers, they've got modern schools, they've got a heater system, they've got open windows, they've got Art Deco buildings, they've got everything you can imagine. Heck, they've even got vocational agricultural stuff. Some of you are thinking, well, what's that? It's, what do they call vocational ag today? It's not vocational ag, it's vocational to me. But like welding and electrical work, HVAC, and, shop class or ag class, you might call it. It's like career and technology, CTE, career technology and engineering. All of which is to say, New London was an impressive school district for the time period. They were a crown jewel. And the New London School District was looking for a way to cheaply, because a lot of these New London boys, they may be wealthy, but they're not what you'd call, they're not Harvard trained. They're not Texas A&M trained for the most part. I imagine maybe very few people from New London actually went to college. I'm not slamming them when I say that. I'm just saying is that most people didn't go to college back then. This is before the GI Bill. This is before all that stuff that puts you and me through college. So a lot of those farmers, by their nature, were frugal, very frugal, thrifty, and that's the positive side. You might say something else. But the fact was they were looking to heat those buildings in East Texas, those school buildings in East Texas, and do it as cheaply as possible. One of the practices of the oil industry back in that time period, the 1930s, was that you kept the oil and you vented or you blew off the gas, the wet gas as it was called. The wet gas itself had no value. There wasn't a natural gas industry. You didn't produce electricity by natural gas in that time period. And so if it has no value and it's just helping to bring up the oil, all the better, all great. But basically you let it go and you just vent it into the atmosphere. It was a common practice. And so, but you could burn it for heat. I mean, you'll see cities pipe in natural gas, but there wasn't enough, in that time period, there wasn't enough constituents to create a gas company for New London. It just wasn't big enough. Well, anyways, but, at the same time, the school approached these oil companies in East Texas that were in the New London ISD community and said, would you be willing to lay a pipeline, not a big one, but just a pipe from some of your wells or from a pressure station and send that oil, or rather send that wet gas to the school, and that will just burn it through our furnaces. And the company said, sure, it's good PR, because what you're doing is you're helping keep the kids warm in the school. People appreciate that. And on top of that, I mean, we don't have any use for it anyways. We're just blowing it into the atmosphere. And they did it. It was that natural gas in its natural state, wet gas, it was being pumped into the school. And it was a great deal. Now, I got a question to ask you is, what does natural gas smell like? And so you said rotten eggs, you're wrong. You're wrong. Natural gas has no odor. In its natural state, and that's when I kept calling it wet gas, or its natural state. That was the tell for me. I was tipping my hand is that it has no natural odor. And you say, well, I've had a leak in my furnace. I left the stove on, just accidentally didn't turn it off just right, and it leaked a little bit, and I walked into it and it smelled like rotten eggs. That's the odorization law of Texas, and the other states have similar things, some before us and some after us. But what had happened in New London at 3:05 p.m., and I believe it was in March, but it may have been a little earlier, it may have been more in the wintertime. But anyways, the furnace was burning, and that vocational ag shop was down in the basement of the building, and a kid plugged in, I believe it was a sander, 3:05 p.m., and there would have been a leak. The pipes weren't sealed up just right, and there was a leak of that gas, and they didn't know it because they couldn't smell it. He plugs in the sander, and frankly, any of you have ever seen a plug, and everybody's plugged in this, that, or the other, you know as well as I do that sometimes you get a little spark. And it did it. Blew the school up. Killed 298 people, and most of them children, good number of teachers. What was bad about it all, of course, I mean, it was a horrible tragedy. When you talk about East Texas and that New London school disaster, or school explosion as they called it, we call it historically the school explosion at New London. What ended up happening is that you'd find kids who were missing completely. As this artillery blast had gone off. If you know anything about artillery, it's kind of a similar sort of thing. Some people, if it's a direct hit, they're gone. Other kids will be torn apart like somebody just ripped them to pieces. It's grotesque. And then you'll find little girls, little boys, maybe high schoolers or whatever. It killed a bunch of people, of course. It was not discriminating. You'll find them and you'll look at them and they have not a scratch on their body, yet they are dead. It was probably the concussive blast. Anyways, just destroyed the school. New London, kind of not the same again sort of thing. Men who had been, and this is 37, men who 18, 20 years before had been on the fields of France in the First World War, had seen combat, said this was as bad or worse than they'd ever seen. There were some families who came up looking for their child, and the child was declared missing, and they just never came back again. Others, same sort of thing. They found their child, and they never came back again. It caused a whole lot of consternation, grief, mourning, all those sorts of things that you could imagine. It was a horrible affair. And if you're ever in East Texas, over around New London, they have a memorial and a little museum to that. It's worth your time to go stop in, I would argue. But when you talk about the New London school disaster, one of the things that's also worth noting is, of course, you get the odorization law after the fact. The next time the legislature goes into session, they pass an odorization law and say, we got to do this. So they did. And there was condolences and concerns flowing in, because this was not just a national event. I mean, the rank tragedy of it all, it was just gripping. You will have condolences and sympathies offered through it from around the nation. Franklin Roosevelt will receive, or the U.S. government, because that's the proper channel you send it through, and then forward it on to New London. You're going to receive condolences from the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Premier of France, even the Chancellor of Germany in 1937. And if you know your history, the Chancellor of Germany in 1937 is Adolf Hitler. And if my memory is correct, there is on Reichschancellery stationery a note from Hitler, not handwritten but typed and signed, from Hitler offering his condolences to the death at New London. And so it's not to humanize Hitler and make him a good man. He was obviously a very wicked and evil man, but he was human, and it was that's there. I always found that to be an interesting facet of the story, just a small little nugget and tidbit. Anyways, all of which is to say is that the East Texas oil field and East Texas along the banks of the Trinity River and also the Natchez are going to produce a lot of wealth for a lot of people. So I'm at about an hour and 1 minute, which I find to be about the right length for a lecture, and so I'm going to stop that here. We'll pick up with the story of Texas City in the next lecture, and then Dallas and Fort Worth as well. Thank you. We'll see you next time.